It's not about a bunch of, green hippies talking about grasshoppers. It's about making sure every voice has access to whoever is in power in Brussels. And that sounds like a very legitimate debate to be had, right?
Follow the money.
This is the podcast of the European investigative newsroom Follow the Money. In each edition, we dive into a recent investigation exposing Europe's power brokers, from deceiving companies and influential lobbyists to corrupt politicians and financial fraudsters. I'm your host, Emily Chatinier, recording here from Brussels. And as usual, I'm joined by Follow the Money reporter Alexander Fanta in Vienna. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning. Hello.
In this episode, we're talking about a nasty campaign against Europe's civil society, led not by the far right, but by the most powerful political stronghold in the European Union, the centre-right European People's Party, or the EPP. Alex, before we dive into this saga, it might be good to introduce the party a little bit. Would you say this is Europe's ruling party?
It is certainly the group of political parties that is most powerful in Europe. I think you can fairly say that. It's the largest group in the European Parliament. That means it has significant voting power, but also on the national level in many member states, it is the ruling party or part of a ruling coalition at least. And of course, the two most significant political figures, I would say, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is part of the EPP, and also the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz.
Ursula von der Leyen. She often talks about the importance of democracy and the rule of law, which seems very at odds with the topic that we're discussing today, a campaign against civil society.
So I think you're kind of going into the main conundrum that European politics faces, is that on the EU level, you need legitimacy to make laws. And that legitimacy comes from consulting everyone, talking to anyone who might be involved in the law, so-called stakeholders. That might be industry groups, like big companies, but also with members of civil society, with NGOs, with consumer groups, what have you. And here, the part of the conundrum is, who is legitimate and who might speak about a law? Do you ask the producers of a poisonous pesticide in the same way and give them the same space as somebody who's, advocating for the public interest to reduce the amount of pesticides? And here, the EPP made some very interesting choices.
To dive deeper into this topic, we're joined by not one, but two journalists today. And no less than Follow the Money's deputy editor-in-chief and founder of its Brussels desk, Lise Witteman, alongside investigative journalist Hans Wetzels, who has been closely following European environmental policies for years. So today we're discussing the EPP's recent campaign against NGOs. Lise, can you tell us how this all started?
Yeah, how did it start? The most recent chapter of this actually quite long campaign by now started in the beginning of 2025. With a front page of a Dutch tabloid named De Telegraaf, saying that there has been some shadow lobby going on, and the European Commission has been financing NGOs actually to advocate for their green policies. So this started in January, and it started with the Dutch tabloid, but already the same day, the news traveled to other news outlets and other media started writing about it. It was a topic that was picked up in the European Parliament. So I found this quite remarkable. I have actually worked for the Telegraaf, and I know the journalist who wrote the story, and I know he wouldn't just write something down that is totally not true. So I was like, are NGOs really funded by the European Commission and asked to do things for that money? And so that was the starting point, also because we have looked into the funding of NGOs in the past. We looked into everybody's funding always, so also into the funding of NGOs. And I said to Hans, could you just look into it? What is going on here? And that is actually how we started looking into the matter.
And Hans, when you came across this claim, when Lise told you about it, what made you think this is really something we should dig into further?
Well, since we're not only after business or politicians, right? If there's an actual, like the claim is, shadowy network of NGOs influencing policy, that's also something we as investigative journalists should be looking into.
You started digging into the claim, and what did you find?
I didn't find anything. These contracts are secret, so there is something secret going on here. This all revolves around the Life Fund. The Life Fund is basically a big jar of European money to support environmental actions. It's not only about NGOs, but companies can get money from the Life Fund as well. It's 5.4 billion euros for the 2021-2027 period. And what has happened is that since it's taxpayer money, NGOs who apply for a grant, they have to hand in a work plan to the Commission, which is basically explaining to the Commission, look, we received this money. This is what we're going to do with it. And these work plans can be quite detailed. So these work plans do exist, and it's basically a list of topics they plan to spend the money on, right? Once you start looking into it, there's nothing that resembles like the marching orders the Telegraaf was claiming that were given by the Commission to NGOs to act on behalf of the Commission, to lobby members of Parliament for certain green files, etc., and so forth. It was completely the other way around. At least that's what I found. And I looked into several of these contracts. It seems that it's simply NGOs saying, hey, this is what we do with the taxpayer money you give us to do advocacy, lobbying, etc.
Yeah, what is good to understand, I think, is that in the article, there was also one or two MEPs and members of the European Parliament who framed the findings. They framed what is in the contract. So they said, so in those contracts and in the working plans that are a part of that, NGOs say what they do. They say, well, we lobby certain members of the European Parliament to advocate for certain green policies. And then they said, well, these are marching orders. But what it turned out to be, and what the European Commission also explained, is, no, these aren't marching orders. We just give them the money to do what they do, and we ask them to just be transparent about the things they do and lay it all down in those working plans. So it's the other way around. It's like the NGOs just do what they do and they use the money. And this went on, and especially the EPP, the European People's Party as a whole, really started pushing this narrative on the socials, in press. So it was very clear that it was a setup to start pushing this narrative that NGOs are not to be trusted. It's all part of some sketchy shadow lobby, and it's also a setup.
And so you were saying that this came from the EPP. The news was first brought out by a Dutch tabloid. And who was pushing that accusation initially? Was that also the EPP?
Yeah, so it was. So normally, of course, civil society is a lot under attack in the whole of Europe, outside of Europe, obviously. And we are sadly used to it in countries like Hungary or Poland. And now, especially the far right parties have a tendency to be critical on NGOs. Why? Because most of the time those NGOs say, hello, far right party, what you're doing to human rights or to freedom of speech or to the media is not okay. So they are, opposing often the ideas of the far right parties. But to have such a huge mainstream party, the European People's Party, really fueling this narrative is quite remarkable. And therefore, we found it was very important to see what is right and what is wrong about it.
Just to chip in, I mean, wasn't that just journalists uncovering new evidence? Why do you think that this is a campaign by the EPP rather than just journalists doing their job?
Yeah, sadly, it was the latest chapter in a very long time running campaign. Already in 2017, I will now really take you back in time. Maybe you recall TTIP. That was the proposed transatlantic trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. And this was much a topic between 2011 and 2017. And the United States and some countries in the European Union, especially Germany. And then at a certain point, some NGOs said, yeah, but wait a minute, this is not some technical debate. This is about like very big issues, very essential questions. And this should be debated in the public domain, in national parliaments, in the media. And so the civil society started organizing campaigns, organizing protests, approaching media, and they really work together on this. And they managed to put this topic on the agenda. And in the end, there was this big debate indeed. And it was decided that TTIP could not continue because the political parties in the European Union didn't feel that they had a mandate to push it forward. And the European People Party in the European Parliament and their parties in the national member states felt this was the mistake of the NGOs and that the NGOs hadn't really fulfilled the interests of Europe by failing TTIP. So that was in 2017. And then a few years later, it started again. And this time it was around Qatargate. Qatargate was this big bribery scandal in 2022 involving MEPs that had been allegedly funneled money through a fake NGO named Fight Impunity. And then the EPP saw this not as an opportunity to say, the European Parliament should maybe work on corruption and transparency. No, they saw this opportunity to start again the whole campaign against NGOs, saying, you see, an NGO is actually being used to funnel bribery money. We can't just trust NGOs. And so that was the restart of the campaign against NGOs. So far, this little history class.
What you said post-Qatargate, because the EPP, their argument is this is just about wanting to improve transparency for NGOs. We just want to look into what they're doing with their money. How do you look at their argument, Hans?
Well, I'm not going to say there's not an issue with transparency, but that issue lies with the European Commission. The fact that there are contracts, and yes, these contracts include work plans, and yes, these are secret. That's an issue. The European Court of Auditors recently also did a report on this, and they also say there's an issue with transparency. The only thing is that the issue does not lie with the NGOs per se. So there's a core controversy around transparency, yes, but it's not about, and it's not the fault of these NGOs.
So these groups get public money and they promise something in return, kind of promising to advocate around the actions they're known for, which is reasonable. But then it's very hard to understand why it would be so difficult to just simply publish these contracts. Hans, what does the Commission say about that when they're asked about that?
The main argument is basically that they disclose financial information and that it's privacy concerns. While I also talk to NGO people, right, and they also ask for more transparency.
The European People's Party holds, all the power to change it. So this is not only just focusing on the wrong group, but it's also highly hypocritical to speak about the need for more transparency if this is actually the group that has been fighting against more transparency at every level for decades.
And zooming out even more from that transparency argument, I think something a lot of people wonder is also, why do these NGOs even get money from the EU at all? What's the reason for that, Lise?
Yeah, so we are talking about a fund. It's named the Life Fund, and that has been around also for decades because the very reason that the European Union feels there should be money for NGOs is to gain actually legitimacy for the European Union itself. You could still see the European Union as some kind of new democracy, right? The European Parliament has been around only for a few decades. Many of the laws and regulations that we live by day to day are debated in Brussels and initiated in Brussels. So to have legitimacy and to say, okay, but these are really legitimate laws, you have to be able to say, but these were debated with all the public interests in mind, all the views in mind. And so the European Union needs also the voices of civil society to voice environmental views, human rights views, and to be able to really say all the laws that we are making, we really talk with everybody. Well, of course, business has their own funding to fund advocacy, but NGOs, environmental NGOs, the trees won't pay an NGO to start advocating for them. Therefore, it's hard for them to gain money. You need donations, philanthropy, or indeed a bit of government funding to also have these views and voices heard.
You guys have debunked the scandal. We know the scandal did not happen the way the EPP presented it. And what I noticed is that when I open my feed on now X, many parliamentarians, many MEPs are still talking about it. And Hans, why do you think this so-called lobby scandal has become such powerful political ammunition?
In light of this current campaign against NGOs we are talking about, it's also a political element that fits into this whole story Lise just told you. And that's rise of the right-wing populism with the BBB, the Farmer Citizens Movement in the Netherlands, gaining like big in elections in 2023. And you see like especially the German EPP wing, which is of this big European party. The Germans are the most powerful grouping, right? And you see that they're on the verge of panic. And I got this from EPP sources, who I cannot name right now. In Germany, you have Alternative for Deutschland on the rise, who are also trying to frame this as the farmers and people's voice. And the EPP starts tilting to the right, tilting toward them being this farmers and people's party. German EPP leadership, basically, they literally say in a position paper 2 months after the BBB won the elections in the Netherlands, that they're going to take aim at this green law, this green law, and this green law. In a sense, it resonates with many people that are on the political right, because all these environmental concerns, etc., and so forth, many of them don't like that. You see, like, farmers' protests around Europe, for a lot of reasons, are legitimate, right? But they're also aligning with a right-wing agenda saying this is the fault of the Green Deal, or all these evil NGOs that are trying to make our life and business lives very, very difficult.
Yeah, because you're saying the farmers' protests are legitimate. What are the concerns that they're voicing in those protests?
I think many farmers are, rightfully so, I'd say, are afraid of not being able to make a living. And there are reasons for this. It has to do with market dominance of big players, of traders, of the system itself, dependency on input providers, whatnot, right? But there's many reasons we should talk about why farmers are in the precarious position they're in now. But the Green Deal is not one of those.
Yes, let me chip in here. So the Green Deal is the big, was launched in 2019 as the European Union's approach to fight climate change and also environmental issues. And what is very interesting, and especially as just as Hans is now just saying, is for the last few years we saw a lot of farmers protest, and they protest their position in the food chain, quite literally, because there are like these big players higher up in the food chain, seed providers or traders of food, that really benefit from very low agricultural product prices, because then, they can easily, because then there's a big mass for low prices that they can more easily trade on the world markets, for instance. And so that is the reason that farmers are having a tough time in the European Union. The Green Deal actually aimed to change this position of farmers and to better this position of farmers. But instead of the European People's Party and other right-wing parties embracing it, they used the farmers' protest that were essentially a protest against their current situation to say, no, these protests are actually against the Green Deal. And so that is one of the biggest narratives, a misleading narrative that is still around in Europe today. And so the European People's Party has misused this narrative when the far right, when they were afraid of the far right parties beating them, to start beating up the Green Deal instead, and fighting the Green Deal and started fighting NGOs. So yeah, I cannot begin to explain how many misleading positions are part of this whole campaign. And that's so worrying because, of course, everyday citizens, you don't read this kind of stuff in the newspaper. You don't know what your MEP is actually doing in the European Parliament. And so they can just play around and spin their positions without, anyone being aware of what the actual truth is. And I think that is very typical for the age, of course, that we are living in, not only in Europe, but also in the United States and around, that the truth kind of tends to get lost within all the narratives, and that there is not so much space for looking into facts anymore.
The entire European Green Deal, wasn't that very much like a flagship project of Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President from the EPP? What do you think about that, Alex?
Well, I mean, the Green Deal came out of a very interesting political alignment. So in 2019, there were European Parliament elections, and the EPP once again became the strongest party in the European Parliament. But the Greens made big gains in that election, and they made some important concessions. One of them being to say, well, climate change is a serious problem. We have environmental degradation in many European countries. We need to do something about it. So the Green Deal was a way of addressing climate change, was addressing environmental problems. And that, out of this kind of big compromise came out something that was very ambitious, comprehensive set of laws to, kind of do different things like, fighting deforestation, reducing CO2 emissions, but also like kind of keeping more nature preserves. This set of policies was very much advanced and brought through with the votes of EPP members of the European Parliament. But then some of the very same people after the elections last year decided to completely change tack and now are opposing the very laws that they voted for.
And why is that?
It's the political winds have shifted. The far right is now in the ascendancy. The Green Party's lost a lot of the votes they gained the last time. So what we're seeing is a massive realignment of European politics along the lines of Trump and America, in a sense. So to appease the far right, it is felt prudent to roll back a lot of environmental legislation. It's become part of the anti-woke, anti-DEY campaign. On the business end of European politics, they think that growth is being stifled by green policies. So industry lobbies are pushing to roll back what they call red tape, what other people might call prudent environmental legislation, prudent social protections. Yeah. And in this kind of context, climate policies are being rolled back basically to appease the business community. And to make that work politically, it is framed as a way of, kind of restoring former industrial glories, something like that.
So we have to start with an EPP that's very much championing green policies, the Green Deal. Then they're getting worried because they're losing votes to the far right. And flash forward, they start attacking NGOs for doing some lobbying scandal. And in a way, NGOs became the victim of their fear of losing votes to the far right. Is that correct?
I think that's the world we now live in. It's also, I feel we need to say something here because we've been talking about narratives a lot. I think NGOs are not above using narratives that, kind of sometimes stretching the truth. So I think in the TTIP debate, there was a chlorinated chicken, this idea that, the US has way lower standards of food production and would, for instance, just kind of put a lot of chemicals on chickens before they're being sold as meat. That was a narrative that, became a kind of truth during the debate, and it turned quite acrimonious. So whether or not these kind of chlorinated chickens would enter the European market after the treaty was done or not, that became something that NGOs campaigned on. Now, does that make kind of the whole, does that delegitimize NGOs who use it? Not necessarily, but I think what we also need to think about is the imbalance of power. So the industry lobby accounts for, in some topics, it accounts for 4 in 5 lobby meetings with the Commission. In some, it's even 9 in 10. The industry lobby has a lot more resources, and also the industry groups, corporations usually speak for their own interests. They speak for themselves, whereas NGOs, at least in theory, speak for a broader public interest, which is not usually represented. So in a sense, we need NGOs often to say things that nobody else will say.
It's not only about trees, right? It's also indeed about pesticide concerns. We're now learning more and more how widespread pesticides are and also the dangers that come with it. And if it's only the chemical industry that the European Commission would be talking with, they wouldn't ever hear those concerns. So also it's not only for, how many grasshoppers are around. It's also for our own city that, these kind of voices are heard.
Exactly. It's about democratic legitimacy in a town where transparency isn't always per se a priority anyway. And it's not about a bunch of, green hippies talking about grasshoppers. It's about making sure every voice has access to whoever is in power in Brussels. And that sounds like a very legitimate debate to be had, right?
People might be thinking we're editorializing here. Lise or Hans, isn't there some legitimacy to the idea that too much green regulation could end up stifling European economy?
This is, in a sense, this is a very fair debate. And we are here to applaud democratic debates and to encourage all the facts and information to be part of such a debate. So that's the only thing. When we say it's important to make sure NGOs are heard, it's not because we adopt the voices and the policies of NGOs one-on-one. Actually, we've written a lot about NGOs and their funding. We've written about the Open Society foundations of George Soros being located on the Cayman Islands. And you understand
no tax.
And yeah. Indeed. So you understand that not everybody was very happy about this. We would write about everything. The only thing that we advocate for, I'm happy to say we advocate for transparency, rule of law, democracy, and that a fair, open debate is possible also on the level of the European Union.
It's a legitimate debate on how we want to achieve economic growth. Europe's economies are struggling, and yes, green legislation can and does play a role in that. And it's important to have that debate. What I find annoying personally is that that's not what this campaign is about. If the EPP would come forward and address exactly this, it's like, look, of course, we'll have that debate. That's important. That's called democracy. But it's not about that. It's about building this narrative about this strange, shadowy threats from NGOs behind the smokescreen that are illegitimately influencing parliamentarians, which is factually not the case. So I would applaud if somebody would come up and say, let's have this actual factual debate, which is not happening. But that's the issue I have with it. It's a fake news campaign. I hate that term, but this is an actual fake news campaign.
Yeah, it's also, I think one has to push back a bit against the narrative that environmental legislation only imposes an undue economic constraint. In fact, what you often see is that environmental legislation favors one business, one kind of type of business over another. So, we might phase out fossil fuel cars, so that opens a new kind of opportunities of business for electric cars, or you say, well, we're just gonna tax the certain types of fuel more that might favor heat pumps as an alternative. I think in a sense it's also a bit about legislation is a way of directing the economy or kind of shaping how the economy exactly functions, and whether you do it or not, you are doing that as a legislator. You're kind of shaping how the economy works. So I think having a fair debate about that involves hearing both self-interested and public interest stakeholders, and that, you can't cut the NGOs out from that debate. And what the EPP, what parts of the press are now doing is attacking one group of, one set of voices in that debate is basically making the choir so much more uninteresting, making that debate so much poorer.
And of course, looking at the global context, especially in the US, we've seen this huge trend of Trump really cutting a lot of NGO funding. The anti-NGO campaign that we're talking about today, do you see that as like part of this global trend, or would you say this is more of a one-off in a European context?
It's hard to ignore that we see it everywhere around civil society as a whole. Not only EU funding is at risk, but of course also US aid. That also had a lot of influence on civil society in Europe. Many organizations were at least partly funding by US aid. We see philanthropy cutting back, especially American philanthropy that also had a big impact on European NGOs. It's cutting back money. So many NGOs at this moment that are active in Brussels are really struggling to have enough funds to be able to do their work, to be able to do the proper research they need to base their arguments, to have enough people to talk with the people of the European Commission. I think the impact of civil society is declining as we speak.
That's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Lise and Hans. And Alex and I will be back soon for another episode.
You've listened to the podcast of Follow the Money. Our watchdog journalism is funded by our members. Subscribe and support European investigative journalism.